What's up guys, we're going to be taking a look at this lab, username enumeration via response timing. So this particular lab is not going to change its HTTP response based on whether the username is valid as part of a username password pair. However, that doesn't mean the response is going to be identical. Depending on whether the username is correct, there will be a different response timing. Now, the difference in response timing is not something that's inherent to the app. It's actually something that we provoke by means of our initial HTTP request. A second aspect to this, it's worth just reading the hint here. To add to the challenge, the lab also implements a form of IP-based brute force protection. However, this can be easily bypassed by manipulating HTTP request headers. So not only do we need to provoke a different response timing from the web app, but we're going to need to sidestep this brute force protection by manipulating request headers. All right, let's fire up the lab. So the first step here is simply to capture a login request. So let's click on the My Account option. We'll use a valid username and we're going to use an incorrect password, which we'll just type as password. We'll choose login. We get the response invalid username or password. Now we know in this case the username is valid, but it doesn't really make a difference to the response. Here's a copy of the login request in Burp. It really doesn't make a difference whether the username is valid or not. So here is with a valid username. Let's now submit an invalid username. In terms of response timing, it's more or less identical. The other aspect to this is if I continue to click the send button, notice now I get the response, you have made too many incorrect login attempts. Please try again in 30 minutes. So let's deal with this issue first so that we're free to test the lab with as many requests as we want. As mentioned in the lab overview, we can make use of an additional HTTP header in order to sidestep this. And the header we're going to make use of is x_4, sometimes referred to as XFF. And this is useful when a request is being sent on behalf of a sender. For example, imagine a request is coming into this web app through a proxy. Well, the web app's going to see the IP address of the proxy, but what it might really be interested in is the IP address of the sender. So in many cases, the proxy may add the x_4 HTTP header to indicate the IP address of the original sender. And often these HTTP requests could be chained through multiple proxies, in which case x_4 could in fact be a list of IP addresses. Now let's create a fake IP address. In fact, you don't really need to use a full IP address in this case. You could actually just use a number. Let's focus on the last digit of the IP request, which we're going to iterate through to spoof different IP addresses. So now if I choose send again, notice that we do actually get to send the request to the server. If I click the button a few times, we'll eventually get the message you have made too many incorrect login attempts, at which point I can simply iterate to the next integer, resend the request. We've bypassed the IP-based brute force protection. Now here's where things get interesting. The way this app is set up is that it presumably only checks the password if the username is valid. And the time it takes to check the password is linked to the password length in this case. So if we include an extremely long password, when we send this request to the backend, it's going to be instant in the response because the username is not valid. This password was never checked. When we submit a correct username to the backend, now a password check takes place. It's just going to take a while because the password is so long. Let's click send. Note the obvious delay from the server. The key idea here is that we are provoking a difference in the response based on whether the username is valid, which allows for username enumeration. Now at this stage, we have everything we need to set up an intruder attack. So let's right click on this request, send to intruder. We're going to need payload markers around two pieces of data. First, we're going to need to iterate through different spoofed IP addresses so that our brute force attack doesn't get blocked. So we're going to add payload markers around the last integer of that spoofed IP address. Then the second set of payload markers needs to be around the username because we're looking to enumerate a second valid user in this vulnerable lab. In terms of the attack type, we actually want a pitchfork attack. The pitchfork attack doesn't try every possible combo of the two different payload markers. It tries payload 1 from both payload markers, then it tries payload 2 from both payload markers. So with a pitchfork attack, we can have a unique spoofed IP address for every username that we attempt to enumerate. Let's choose pitchfork. Let's head to the payloads tab. So we are provided with a word list of potential usernames. So we're going to copy that from the Portswigger site. Let's start with payload set 2. The reason why I do this is because I'm interested in seeing how long the list is. So we can see payload count 101. That gives us a good idea of how many IP addresses we need to spoof. Payload set 1 is going to be numbers. Let's start from 3 just because we may have exhausted our ability to request login with the first 2 IP addresses. So from 3 to 103. So that should give us 101 unique IP addresses. In fact, let's do 104. Okay, so everything's in place. Let's choose start attack. We have 2 sets of payloads. So payload 1 is going to be that trailing integer on the spoofed IP address. And payload 2 is going to be the word list of usernames provided by Portswigger. We're interested in response received. We can see at the moment that the response time is very low, but we're expecting when we use a valid username that the response time is going to be a lot longer because we have that very long password check that's going to take place. We can now see request 53. We have payload in terms of the username Alaska, response received 2482. So this is clearly a valid username in this case. And at this point, we can actually end the attack. So heading back to our intruder attack, we can now delete the payload markers around the username because we've enumerated the valid username Alaska. It's now simply going to be a case of iterating through different passwords to find a valid login. So let's delete our very long password. Let's just type password as a placeholder. We're then going to insert payload markers around password. We are still going to need our payload markers around the IP address because we don't want to get locked out. But let's change one of the early integers so we get a fresh set of spoofed IPs. We have a word list of passwords provided by Portswigger. So it is a bit easier because we know one of these is going to be a valid password. Once again, this is going to be a pitchfork attack because we want to try a unique IP with every password. Let's head to payloads. So we can leave payload set 1 the same. It's just going to iterate through 101 different IP addresses. Now let's head to payload set 2. We can clear the existing lists and we can now paste in our list of passwords. We can see the payload count here is 100. So we know that we have enough spoofed IP addresses for every request. So let's choose start attack. Once again, we can see the IP address under payload 1, or at least the last integer of it. And we can see payload 2 is the password. Usually what we're looking for in this case is a 302 found response. At least that's how the vulnerable apps usually work. Let's see if that's the case for this attack. All right, request 60, we have status code 302. That is going to be a valid password. So we have username Alaska, password Michelle. So we can end this attack. We already have what we're looking for. Username Alaska, password Michelle, login. So we are still locked out in this case. So obviously it's going to be fairly tricky to solve the lab if you are still locked out. So it might be a good idea not to exhaust the original IP in terms of triggering the brute force protection. But here's a workaround. If you send a request using burp, so we sent the valid login to the repeater, we got the 302 found response. I then right clicked, choose request in browser. In current browser session, I then copied this URL. If we paste the URL into the browser, we now get the flag, congratulations, you solved the lab. I should probably also mention that it's not just a valid login request, but we've also re-added the HTTP X forwarded for header. And you can just provide an arbitrary integer. It doesn't need to be a fully fledged IP address. So a couple of key takeaways from this lab. Number 1, we may be able to provoke a change in response time based on the request we send to the backend, which then allows for username enumeration. Even if the HTTP response itself is identical, the time the request takes could leak information regarding whether a username is valid. Second takeaway here is that it might be possible to use the X forwarded for header to spoof our IP address. Now, of course, the server can still see our real IP address. It just depends on whether it uses our real IP address or the IP address contained in X forwarded for header in order to set up the brute force protection. So this is not guaranteed to work, but in this case, it's very clear that the vulnerable lab looks at the X forwarded for header to determine the IP address of the sender and uses that to determine whether a certain IP address should be locked out. So it's one possible method of spoofing our IP address and avoiding brute force IP-based protection. All right, that's pretty much it for this lab. Hope you found it helpful. Thanks very much for checking out the content, and I'll see you guys in the next lab.